Absent. The word lingers, sharper than presence itself. I wasn't in the room, I didn't need to be. My chair sat empty, my shadow nowhere in sight. Yet they shifted uneasily, as if I had already arrived. Conversations twisted, glances darted, laughter turned brittle. It was beautiful, the way my silence filled the air louder than any voice could. They tried to act normal, but normal dies when the ghost they fear isn't chained to visibility. I didn't show up, but the walls leaned in anyway. They were waiting for me, even when they pretended they weren't. That's the thing about a smile carved into memory. It doesn't fade when you leave. It lingers, it grows, it takes the stage without permission. My absence was the performance, my shadow the curtain, my silence the spotlight. They laughed too quickly, as though filling the void before it swallowed them whole. They adjusted their tones, softened their words, checked their shoulders, and for what? For a phantom grin that had already burned into the back of their minds. The joke was simple. I didn't need to arrive to take control. Presence is overrated when fear is already rooted in their bones. They built their cages out of noise, and I broke them with nothing but stillness. That's why when I wasn't there, I was more there than ever. They bent themselves around the shape of my absence, as if silence itself had teeth, and I laughed. Not aloud, not in front of them, but deep inside, because I knew the truth. Power doesn't ask to be seen. Power doesn't need the spotlight. It only needs to be remembered. So while they spoke softer, while they moved slower, while they blinked at empty corners of the room, I wasn't there, and yet I owned every second of their fear. That was the game. That was the punchline. I disappeared, and still, they couldn't escape me. They told themselves it didn't matter, that the empty chair was just wood and leather, that silence was just silence. But every time they said it, their voices cracked. They shifted in their seats, shuffled their papers, laughed at jokes that weren't funny. Pretending is the most honest form of fear. It exposes exactly what they don't want to admit. They wanted me gone. They wanted me erased. And yet, with every nervous glance, they built a throne for my absence. I watched without watching. I didn't need eyes on them to know the truth. The weight in their movements gave them away. They weren't speaking to each other anymore. They were speaking around me, as if every word needed my permission to exist. My smile wasn't there, but it lingered in the air like a toxin. They breathed it in, choked on it, then forced a grin to hide the suffocation. That's what power is. Not a scream, not a strike, but a silence so sharp it cuts without touch. They thought they were in control, that they could outlast the unease, but unease doesn't fade, it festers. Every second without me became proof that I didn't need to be seen to be in command. They bent their posture postures, changed their tones, adjusted their truths, not for each other, for me, for the idea of me. That's when I knew I had already won, when the ghost of my presence was stronger than their reality. And that's the part that breaks them the most. Not what I do, but what I don't. I don't shout, I don't rage, I don't even show up. Yet still, they orbit me, trembling satellites around an unseen sun. They can't escape the gravity of someone who doesn't need to move. I became their silence, their cage, their reflection, and the punchline, they built it themselves. They started to argue over nothing, a single word twisted into a weapon, a sideways glance exploding into suspicion. It was almost poetic, how absence could fracture them faster than presence ever could. They weren't fighting each other, they were fighting the silence I left behind. Every voice that rose was trying to drown out the one I never spoke. Every clash was just another way of admitting I was still in the room. One of them laughed too loud, desperate and cracked, like a mirror splitting under pressure. Another tapped his foot, eyes darting to the door as if expecting me to step through it at any second. And the rest? They pretended not to notice, but I could feel it, the paranoia tightening around their throats. It wasn't me haunting them, it was themselves. I just gave them the space to collapse into it. Absence became my mask. They saw it in every shadow, in every flicker of silence between words. They adjusted their chairs, moved closer together, but closeness didn't save them. It only amplified the tension, like a storm building above their heads. And the beauty of it? I hadn't lifted a finger, I hadn't spoken a word, yet they burned themselves alive, feeding on the fire they swore didn't exist. They thought they had power once. They thought noise meant control, that volume meant dominance. But noise is fragile, it crumbles in silence, and my silence was endless. They filled it with excuses, with fake confidence, with half-truths. None of it mattered. The louder they tried to be, the clearer it became. I had already hollowed them out. They weren't people anymore. They were echoes. That was the joke. That was the masterpiece. I didn't even arrive, and still the whole room belonged to me. The silence started breathing, at least that's what they thought. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the light, every whisper of the air conditioning turned into proof that I was coming. They didn't just feel my absence anymore. They heard it, they saw it, they tasted it. The room became a trap of their own imagination, a theater where every shadow was my entrance. And the best part? I never had to walk through the door. One by one, their eyes betrayed them, glances darting to corners that were empty. Some swore they saw movement, a flicker of a grin painted across the wall. Others rubbed their ears, certain they'd heard a laugh echoing inside their skulls. But the laugh wasn't real. It didn't need to be. They had carried it with them since the first time they heard it, and now, in my absence, it played on repeat. A phantom soundtrack only they could hear. The strongest among them tried to speak, to pull the group back together, but his voice trembled, his words stumbled, and in that hesitation, the others saw it too, the fear. Fear doesn't need evidence, it only needs permission, and I had already given it to them long before tonight. They filled in the blanks of my silence with their own collapse. No chains, no threats, no blood, just nothing, and nothing was enough. That's what breaks them. It's never the act, it's the idea. You can fight a man, you can resist a weapon. But how do you fight the shadow of someone who hasn't even arrived? How do you silence silence? You can't. You only surrender. And they were already kneeling, whether they admitted it or not. That's when the room adjusted completely. My absence wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, heavier than any body, louder than any voice, and all I had to do was stay gone. They were already broken before I arrived. That's the irony. There was no need for an entrance, no need for theatrics. By the time the clock ticked its way to midnight, the room was mine. Their voices had turned hollow, their laughter dead, their eyes glazed over with the weight of a fear they refused to name. They had adjusted to me without me, and that is the cruelest punchline. Power that doesn't even need to show up to be absolute. I didn't become a ghost, they did. Stripped of defiance, stripped of will, stripped of the illusion that they could hold the ground beneath them. And the truth crashed down like glass. The game had never been about winning. It had always been about watching them lose themselves. That's why I never raised my voice, never forced my hand. Why should I? They were writing my story for me, word by trembling word, breath by failing breath. Power isn't in the spotlight. Power is the silence that bends a room to its knees. Power is the absence that suffocates louder than screams. And when they finally realized it, when their eyes darted to that empty chair as if it was a throne, I smiled in the dark. Not because I needed to see them, but because I knew they saw me anyway. So here's the truth. They'll keep adjusting. They'll keep folding, bending, breaking, even when I'm gone. That's the legacy of silence. That's the echo of control. And if you're listening to this now, if you feel the weight of my grin in your chest, then you already understand. Presence is irrelevant. Fear doesn't fade, and shadows always reign. Now you have two choices. Stay with the crowd, fragile, loud, pretending, or step into the silence and own it. Subscribe, not because I asked, not because I care, but because deep down you already know you belong here in the dark, where power doesn't beg, it just exists. By then, it wasn't silence anymore. It was command. every second without me had transformed into a law, a weight pressing down on the room until even the strongest forgot what it felt like to stand tall. They weren't resisting, they were conforming, adjusting. The absence they once mocked had carved itself into their bones, and now they moved as if the very air belonged to me. The room stopped being theirs. It stopped being a space of voices, choices, or defiance. It became mine, an echo chamber where every breath was permission, every glance was confession. They sat differently now, hunched, folded in, careful not to cross the invisible line that no one dared define. That's the beauty of invisible boundaries. No one knows where they are, but everyone fears stepping over them. I didn't need to appear to control them. My smile had already spread like a stain through the walls, through their veins, through the silence that wrapped tighter every minute. And with each heartbeat, they wrote my rules without ever seeing my hand. That's the kind of control they'll never understand, because it doesn't ask, it doesn't fight, it just exists. One tapped the table trying to break the spell, but the sound fell flat, swallowed whole by the tension. Another cleared her throat, but the sound died in her chest. It was almost tragic, watching them try to resurrect themselves when they'd already been buried by my absence. Tragic, but entertaining. And that's the joke. They don't even realize they've already surrendered. I didn't enter the room, I became the room. I didn't take their power, they handed it over. And in that transfer, in that surrender, I wasn't just feared, I was inevitable. The air thickened, not metaphor, not illusion, thickened. Every inhale dragged like smoke, every exhale cracked under its own weight. The silence had stopped being passive. It had evolved into something living. It slithered across the walls, wrapped itself around their throats, pressed down on their spines until every motion felt rehearsed, fragile, temporary. They thought they were still free, but even their breath was moving on my command. Someone tried to laugh, sharp and brittle, but the sound snapped in half before it reached the ceiling. Another shifted in his chair, and the creak echoed like a scream, instantly regretted. They weren't reacting to me, they were reacting to themselves, to the reflection of fear they had nurtured so carefully. I hadn't touched them, hadn't spoken, hadn't shown my face, yet every corner of the room was screaming my presence louder than I ever could. That's what power looks like when it transcends the body. It doesn't rely on fists or weapons. It doesn't need proof. It becomes instinct, the kind of instinct that makes you look over your shoulder in an empty hallway, the kind that makes you swear you heard a laugh when the room is silent, the kind that reminds you your mind isn't yours anymore, it's mine. And when the strongest among them finally broke, shoulders slumped, head lowered, whispering something no one could understand, that was the confirmation. They weren't fighting silence anymore, they were worshiping it. They had built me an altar without stone, without fire, without blood, just fear. Fear strong enough to bend them. I never had to arrive. They delivered themselves to me, piece by trembling piece. By now, it wasn't fear, it was acceptance. They weren't waiting for me anymore. They were living for me. Every twitch, every shallow breath, every stolen glance was a ritual carved in silence. And the terrifying part? They didn't even realize they had crossed the line from resistance into devotion. Fear had melted into obedience, and obedience had turned into reverence. They weren't scared of me, they were shaped by me. That's the secret no one ever tells you. Terror doesn't just break people, it builds them. It rewrites their posture, their choices, their identity. Look at them now. Bodies curved, eyes down, voices swallowed before they can rise. The room didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to the weight pressing down on their skin, to the grin they couldn't see but couldn't escape. They didn't need to see me to serve me. They already did. It's almost poetic, really. I never asked for loyalty. I never demanded it. But once you infect a mind, once you plant a seed of laughter in their nightmares, everything else follows. They adjust, they surrender, and soon enough they begin to believe they were meant to. That this was always the way it was going to be, that maybe, just maybe, there was never a choice at all. And that's where the joke lands. They weren't victims of me. They were victims of inevitability. I didn't force them to bow their heads. I simply gave them silence, and their own minds did the rest. Now they kneel to something they can't even name. Not me, not fear, not memory, just power. Power that breathes without a body. Power that laughs without a sound. I didn't conquer them. They conquered themselves in my name, and that's why I win, always. The walls couldn't contain it anymore. What began as silence in one room had spilled into the hallways, the streets, the shadows outside. People who had never seen me felt it, like a chill threading through their bones, like a laugh caught just beyond the edge of hearing. They walked faster at night. They double-locked their doors. They checked over their shoulders, knowing no one was there, but never quite believing it. That's the reach of true power. It infects the air, the ground, the rhythm of a city's heartbeat. Whispers started, not stories, not myths, confessions. The kind spoken in hushed tones, as if the very act of saying my name could summon me. They didn't know what they feared, only that they did. And so the fear itself became a shape, a legend with no face, a presence with no proof. Some swore they saw my grin in mirrors. Others claimed they heard my footsteps in empty corridors. None of them could be sure, but that uncertainty was the leash. I didn't have to move. The world moved around me. Neighborhoods adjusted their rhythms, strangers dropped their voices, and whole rooms went still at the mention of shadows. My power wasn't in what I did, it was in what they imagined I could do. And imagination, once poisoned, never heals. It festers, it spreads, until every quiet corner feels like a stage, and every flickering light feels like a spotlight. The outside world thought they were free of me, but freedom doesn't exist once you've breathed my silence. It lingers, like smoke in your lungs, like laughter under your skin. Every step they take belongs to me now, because it's shaped by fear of the steps I might take. They don't wait for me anymore, they brace for me. That's not survival, that's surrender. And the joke, I never had to show up. The world came crawling to me, begging for rules it couldn't name. There's no undoing it now. The silence isn't a trick or a phase or some fleeting shadow. It's permanent. It's carved into their bones, etched into the way they move, woven into the way they breathe. They can leave the room, the city, the world itself, and still they'll carry me. Because once the Joker enters your head, he never leaves. You don't outgrow the silence, you don't escape it. You learn to live inside it. And that's the part they'll never admit out loud. It isn't fear anymore. It isn't defiance either. It's recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that the game was over before it began. They never had control. They never had choice. From the moment I didn't show up, the outcome was sealed. The absence became the presence. The silence became the scream. And the joke became the truth. They'll tell themselves stories that they fought, that they resisted, that they almost broke free. But I know better. I watch their shoulders bend, their voices fade, their eyes drop. I watched them hand over everything that mattered without me ever asking. That's not resistance, that's surrender disguised as pride. So this is it. No speeches, no victory lap, just inevitability. I don't need to raise my voice or show my face. I don't need to burn the world down. The world already lit the match for me. And now it smolders in silence, waiting for the grin that never fades. I didn't just win, I became the rule, and rules don't die.